Norway's eoLithic are rightfully remembered as one of the legendary lineups in the history of Counter-Strike. But unfortunately, I think that history has been a little bit too kind to them in terms of how people remember them. Like, they are certainly overrated in terms of what they accomplished, the amount of time they actually spent playing together, the actual results, the amount of money they won, and the real longevity that they had. Because this is a team that only won one big money tournament. They won another couple that weren't for prize money. They were a team that were certainly dangerous for their period of time and were contenders to be the best, and at one point in time briefly the best in the world. But other great teams were around them, and they didn't survive long enough, and they didn't keep the lineups together long enough to truly push it out there and be an all-time great team. Because, for example, when you say eoLithic, there's really 3 different eoLithic lineups, and they all accomplish different things. So when I tell you that they only won less than $17,000 when they were a team, then you'll get a sense of the fact that as a 5-man unit, it's not each together, less than $17,000 as a team. You can see that obviously there were some issues here. Now, it is true that when they were together, they were very good. And at times, like I said, were the best in the world. And the potential certainly was there and would be later on expressed in different teams. And the players within the lineup are some of the best of all time in history. And in different teams accomplished greater feats than they did in eoLithic. But this team itself was kind of a tragedy because the Norwegian scene never really had a chance to support many teams in terms of the finances to travel to events. This team particularly was plagued by sponsorship issues and essentially killed by them to a degree towards the end. So one of the reasons why this team is remembered as like a great team, and if you ask fans of that era, 1.6, they'll even maybe say like they were a top 5 team of all time. The reason why people will say that is because there's a famous statistic about the team that was mentioned at the end of a movie about them, which is absolutely correct, and which makes people, without knowing the context, think that they were the gods, which is that the SK Sweden team at the time, still with the core of Heaton and Potty, 2 of the most successful players of all time and of that era, eoLithic beat them in 6 out of 7 official matches that they played against them. This is absolutely true. But the problem is that needs context. Because if you take that without understanding the context of it, you will overrate them as a team. Because you need to know what tournaments that was in. Some of them weren't in major tournaments. And also you need to know the milieu, the context of the day as to what kind of ambience, what the atmosphere was in which they beat them. Now, they were a significant team in the history of CS. For the impact that they had at the time, they shook up the scene and definitely played a part in who were the champions and who weren't. They allowed Team 9 to win tournaments because at the time Team 9 couldn't beat SK. They beat SK obviously in tournaments. That helped Team 9 win tournaments. That helped themselves be a very good team. And as I mentioned, they did seed some of the great teams of the future and some of the teams that would accomplish great feats. So you've got to go back in time with this team and look at the formation of it. Now, it formed in around September 2002. And the way it formed was, formerly there'd been a team called Spacebar. And Spacebar had been a team that had BSL was the captain, and then they had players like, let me think, well, at the CPL they'd had players like, let me think, Starwatch and Damien, Knoxville, I think Minotauri might even have been in that team. So there was a dispute between the team and the actual internet cafe Spacebar that sponsored them. And BSL, the captain, was on one side of the dispute, and the rest of the team was on the other side of the dispute. So the rest of the team left and made eoLithic, and they got Element to join them. And here's the key background piece here. Most of those players, Nikon, Knoxville, actually BSL previously, Damien, and Element had all been together in a team called Meredia. And that took place before Spacebar, basically leading up to the summer of 2002. And that lineup had gone to a LAN in Norway called GameSphere. And the 2 big teams expected to win this LAN was Game Online, who was one of the best teams in the world, and actually had Veslin standing in and testing out whether he'd want to join this team after he'd been kicked out of NIP, who'd won the World Championship 6 months earlier, or 5 months earlier, whenever this LAN took place. It may have been April, May. They were expected to win the LAN, and the other top team there was Massive Attack, which was Dark and a bunch of players like that, formerly Nikon, but he wasn't in this lineup, I think. And they were also a team. They'd finished 4th at the CPL previously, the big world championship. These two teams were expected to win the LAN, but actually this Norwegian team comes out of nowhere, shocks everyone, wins the LAN. Element's one of the best players in the team. Element gets recruited off to Game Online. He goes off and places 2nd at the CPL summer event, the big major of the summer. Shows himself to be a fantastic player. The other players had made spacebar. They finished, I think, 9th to 12th at that CPL. And so Element rejoining when they form eoLithic makes sense because he had played with them previously, and the Game Online thing was a temporary thing. He'd gone with them, and as you would see from his career, and I'll probably do videos about him in the future, he was a very fickle player who would just change his mind and at his whim because he was so fantastically talented. If he wanted to just go back and play with these people, he'd just leave and go doing that. There were no contracts to the same degree back then. And as a result, even if he was in a top team, he was in theory the 2nd best team in the world. It didn't matter to him. He wanted to go and play with eoLithic. He went back to eoLithic, went back to his Norwegian teammates because obviously the guys in Game Online were Swedish. Now, in this team, their first lineup was Element, in-game leader as well, as far as I remember at this time. Nikon, Knoxville, Damien, Envy, and Luke. In theory, they had a 6-man lineup, though in general, they'd use the lineup without Envy. It'd be Luke, who'd be the 5th man. Now, Element was the star player. He absolutely was one of the best players in the world. Aside from that GameSphere line, in Game Online, he'd shown himself to be a fantastically talented player. The thing about Element's skill set was he didn't have amazing skills. He had like decently well-rounded skills, but not very talented in terms of aiming or just like technique or whatever. But what he had was fantastic positional awareness, spatial awareness of where he was on the map and what he could do, an amazing ability to read the game, as in when an enemy isn't even there, he could kind of have a sense for where they would be and what their movements would be and how to transition between areas of that map without getting caught. And he was a fantastic, essentially to some degrees what you'd consider a lurker now, in terms of this is the primary skill of a lurker, to have a very good sense for this and how to move around the map. And as a result, he was very good in decision making, and he could have a huge impact on a game and win games single-handedly with this skill. So he was the star player, and obviously it was the main reason why people were looking at this team now. But Nikon had been a player in the Massive Attack team, so he had experience, and he was considered, well, he wasn't like a star player at the time. He was like a stable player. He was a strong, stable player. Sort of an MBK of his day. You put him in a spot, he'll hold that spot, he'll play defensively very well. Knoxville, not as skilled, but known around these players, good pistol player. Damien was a skilled player. The problem was he wasn't a very cerebrally quick player. He was a bit of a scatterbrain, but he was a decent player. He was good in clutch situations, and he was just a player that you put him on the map, kind of a dossier type. He moves around the map, he kills people, he gets the next guy in his crosshairs, he kills him. Doesn't necessarily com so much, but he's good at fragging people in this crosshair, basically. Envy was just okay. I think he was mainly friends with some of these players. And Luke was a skilled player, but unfortunately his reign wouldn't be so long-lived in this team. Now then, the tournament that they went to first was in their home country. It was in Norway because there was a CPL Europe event. And the thing about CPL Europe events was they weren't as big a deal as the American ones, because the American ones, which are the summer and winter events, had much bigger prize purses. Like first place at an American one would be minimum 20,000, if not 30,000 for first place. And in fact, first place for the World Championship the year before had been 50,000. First place for CPL Oslo, 4,000 euros, which actually nowadays is just like, it's almost a one-to-one equivalency. So it's about $4,000. Not very much money in contrast, but a number of the top European teams went. This was a pretty stacked tournament in its day. Unfortunately, one of the things that took away from eoLithic's win at the tournament is that the best team in the world, SK Scandinavia, who'd won the previous CPL, the major, a few months earlier, like 2 to 3 months earlier, didn't attend the tournament. And they were a team that had Heaton and Potty, two of the greatest winners of all time, but they also had Dark Executor, two of the best Norwegian players of all time, and Executor in particular, one of the all-time great players along there with Heaton and Potty. So at this tournament, because SK didn't attend, there were some other factors as well, like Team 9, for example. Team 9 had finished 3rd place at the last CPL, but with a mixed lineup of different players. At this tournament, Vestlin was the leader of that team. He was still figuring out the lineup. He actually tried an experimental lineup at this tournament where he took Logic, a guy who'd been in 2Easy, a team that had been rising in the Swedish scene, and then he took Misse, formerly in Game Online actually, but not at that summer, who was a skilled player, who was a Finnish player actually, quite a good player. He took Notorious, who'd been in the Game Online that had finished 3rd at CPL Winter 2001, and he took Soul Edge, also a Game Online player. And so this lineup had a lot of skill on it. It looked like an all-star team to a degree. Actually, it would fail very badly at this tournament. Also, extremely good online was Matrix with Spawn and Scream and a bunch of these guys. Not the Belgian guy, actually a Swedish guy that he stole his nickname from, even the spelling of it. And this team was very good online, used to play from the Matrix Internet Cafe, but they failed this LAN as well. So what ended up happening at this tournament was eoLithic went undefeated through the tournament. In the final, They played against this MTW Sweden lineup, which had Arl, who would obviously become one of the all-time great support players. It had Fisker, who would later go on to success in SK Sweden in 2003. And it had Brunk, who briefly was in SK in late 2002, and mainly was a too easy player beforehand, and this was mainly the too easy lineup, essentially, that Logic had come out of and Arl had come into. And Arl, remember, had been a NIP player the year before. So they beat the MTW team in the final, who many would have thought would have been able to beat them. It was a close game. It was like 13-9 on Nuke. And the only real game in the tournament that had been at all difficult was actually the first round of the bracket, where they played a Danish team called Erratic, who was led by Anarchy, and had Lancelot, who later on went to be an okay player a couple of years later. And this was the only close game, 13-11. We used to use max rounds 12 back then. But other than that, they pretty much comprehensively beat everyone in the tournament and won this tournament. So at the time, people were like, wow, can't wait to see this team versus SK Sweden, SK Scandinavia. Who is the best team in the world? Can they challenge them for this spot? Problem is, literally, we're talking like a month or less later, Element is kicked from the team. And the reason he's kicked from the team is SK Scandinavia has problems within it and it fractures. And some of those players, partly, I think, because they couldn't qualify for World Cyber Games because he had 2 Norwegian players. So they saw how that went and they thought to themselves, we want to go to World Cyber Games in the future. They decided to kick the Norwegian players and they went for all Swedish players in SK. So that meant Executor and Dark were kicked out, 2 very good players. And so Executor was wanted by the guys who were over in the eoLithic team. And they wanted Executor, but Executor comes along, and Executor and Element always had friction. I mean, they were both exceptional players, and so there was friction. It was the old legend versus the new rising kid who wants to like show himself off, that he's got skills, he doesn't respect authority. So there was a clash always between those two. So Executor essentially says, if you want me to join, you got to kick out Element, and Dark's coming with me. He's a package deal. So in come Executor and Dark, and Element essentially gets kicked from the team. He's the star of, he's the in-game leader of. So out goes Element. So Element goes off, he joins Game Online, and he makes a superstar Game Online lineup, which is an all-Nordic lineup. That was Element from Norway, Vicon from Denmark, a very tenured player who played in Spirit of Amiga previously and made a number of CPL placings. They had Soul Edge and Hib, who were brothers, Swedish Orpers, who were in this lineup and always been in Game Online lineups, essentially. And Hib had been in NIP previously, when they'd been the best team. And then finally, they had Missa, the Finnish player. So, now we're left with a brand new eoLithic's. So it's Executor, in-game leader, still a very strong player. Dark, many ways at his peak skill-wise, one of the best players in the world. Earlier in the year, before he joined SK Scandinavia, when he'd been in Vesland's Nordic division briefly and won a CPL there, Vesland had said he was the best player in the world. He was a very skilled player. Nikon, as I said before, Knoxville and Damien. We kept this team overall. So very skilled team still. They go to a CPL qualifier called Mind Trek LAN. And this had all the top Nordic teams there, except Element's new Game Online lineup. That wasn't there. The problem is, at this lineup, SK was trying an experimental new lineup because they didn't have Dark and Execute, remember? They'd kicked them out. So this lineup had Hib. They'd brought him back in. And this is before the new Game Online was fully set. They brought Hib back in because he'd been in NIP before, so they thought that was part of the solution. And then they had these 2 players, Bengen and Kush, who'd been in this team called IDDQD, who I think finished 5th overall at CPL Oslo. So they'd shown off like a very good performance there. It's 4th or 5th. And they brought those guys in. They were Swedish players. Let me think. Were they both Swedish? I think they were both Swedish. And they brought these guys in, but these guys hadn't played much on LAN. Now, at this tournament, in the end, eoLithic would get to play SK Sweden, actually, and they would smash them 13-4. I think it was Dust 2, if I remember correctly. They would meet MTW Sweden again in the final. They would beat them in the final. This is obviously a different eoLithic lineup, though. And by beating them in the final and beating essentially the best of the Europeans, and now SK obviously has lost their classic lineup that's won the major before, now eoLithic's considered the best team in the world. And this is because they won the qualifier. They're going to go to the winter event for 2002, their next major for CPL. The next major for CS 1.6, well, it wasn't 1.6 at the time, it was actually 1.5, which is obviously CPL Winter 2002. That's the major. So because they won this tournament and because Americans hadn't even finished top 3 at the last major, essentially by winning this tournament, they were the de facto best team in the world. Now here's the problem. They chose, because they were so good, Element, the Execute the in-game leader, chose not to have a boot camp. Instead, he thought, well, it doesn't matter, we don't need to. Online, they played in this thing called the Nordic Champions Cup, and they lost to Element's new Game Online team there, which actually then had Hib in it, because Hib had come out of the lineup after that unsuccessful Mind Trek LAN. Instead, they'd brought in Medion, another old NIP player. They'd brought in Brunk instead of, I believe it was Kush. And that was the lineup SK would take to CPL that year. So Nordic Champions Cup, Elements Game Online team managed to beat the eoLithic team. They go to CPL Winter. They come into the tournament as the favourite for the tournament. But, like I said, no boot camp before, which is a famous thing. Usually you would do a boot camp 1 week before a major type tournament. Not only that, at the tournament, I mean, it's up to you whether you can believe this affected them or not, but famously, when they were walking around this little escalator, they were going down it to the tournament area, somehow Executor was like looking around, not thinking, and he got his head like caught somehow on the escalator and like it like went like off some area and like all blood started coming out of his nose. So he said nothing was broken. He said he was fine, but I can't imagine having that happen to your fucking world-beating in-game leader. Helps at least when you're going into games. Now this tournament was a massive shock because first things first, the bracket was announced and the bracket was super stacked on eoLithic's side on the lower part of the bracket. So as a result, the route we expected them to take was they were going to have to play Zex, one of the top NA teams, but it wasn't that land proven with this lineup of Shagwa and Revenge and Sunman and Volcano. And so we thought, okay, they'll beat them, then they'll play Esports United, which was actually Veslin's team, and he had a slightly new lineup at that time. Then we thought if they make it past them, they're going to play Game Online, who's Elements team. And so we thought, what a sick lineup of teams you have to play just to get, I think at that point, to even a top 4 or a top 6 placing. Instead, even more shocking, they lost to Zex in the upper bracket 11-13 on Train. And this was the game that had the famous shot heard around the world, which is when Sunman was in a 1v1 against Damien, and he does this crazy shot where he just shoots through a AWP bullet through 2 walls, because bullets could go through 2 walls, unlike every other weapon, and it actually kills Damien, who's at the back alley on Train, and Sunman's over on the main bomb train at Outer. That's a key round, and then they go on to win 13-11, the Zex team, and do a comeback. At one point, I think the eoLithic team was even up 11 to something, 11-7, 11-8, whatever it was. So that crazy map puts them in the lower bracket. Now, the fact that the lower bracket was the lower half of the upper bracket had been so stacked was also, by the way, why Team 3D, who eventually won the event, actually got to just run through NA teams for the first few rounds before they met SK. So anyway, in the lower bracket, this team plays Team 9, which is actually not to be confused with Veslin's team later on. At the time, Team 9 was the former MTW team that they'd been beating the core of. But MTW had taken in Spawn, who was a very skilled player, but had been failing online with Matrix. And this team beat them 13-11 as well. It was on Cobble. And this was Spawn, this was Arl, this was Fisker. All obviously later SK Sweden players in late 2013. They lost that match, which meant that best case scenario, they could now only finish 7th place. And they played a 7th place decider, and you know what? They lost that as well. I mean, in the lower bracket, they'd beaten some teams you don't care about, but they lose the 7th place decider and to an American team, and not even the best American team. They lost to Riot Squad, who was like the 2nd or 3rd best American team, depending on where you wanted to place them at the time. And they actually lost quite heavily. It was 7-13 on Dust 2, and it's pretty clear by the fact that this team was fantastic on Dust 2. The whole event was off for them. They were off as a team. They had none of the clutch factor. They didn't have the great strats that they seem to have had before, and especially getting wrecked on Dust 2 by an NA team like that. This just showed, I think for the 7th match, they didn't give a fuck because it was like $1,000 difference and they'd lost the tournament. They couldn't win at that point. After you were favoured to win the whole thing, not even finishing top 4, not even finishing top 3. This was very shocking at the time. It was one of the most shocking results in CS history. But next year, a few weeks after that, they were almost qualified for the clan-based Europe Cup 6 finals, and the LAN finals would always have 4 teams there, but it never used to be most of the top teams, because most top teams, I guess, if they started losing, either they didn't compete online, so that was a waste of time, or if they were competing online, they started to lose, they'd say, ah, fuck it, and they just quit. And the qualification system meant only 2 Nordic teams could qualify, because Nordic teams were in their own divisions, and Central European teams, like from the Netherlands, France, Germany, UK, were in their own division as well, so it would always be 2 teams from there and 2 teams from the Nordic region. So, in the end, eoLithic would qualify for this tournament. And actually, they played SK Gaming in an online match to do so. But they actually used Element as a stand-in for Knoxville to play in this online match. They won the match in very close fashion over 2 maps. But then because Clanbase found out they'd used Element as a stand-in, they said that wasn't allowed. They actually made them have to replay the match. But this time SK didn't want to replay the match, so it was a walkover. So they qualified for the LAN finals, and they wouldn't be using Element there because they had the original lineup. The LAN finals actually was a bit underwhelming because the teams there were MTW Germany, who used to be a very good team, but at this point were just an okay team internationally. Advanced Online losers who weren't really anything to write home about at all, of no relevance there. And Okrana Finland were expected to be the good team. They'd been the team that had been pretty good. I think they had like 7th place maybe at CPL Oslo. They were a strong team. They had Zetor, a legendary Finnish player who had been at one point in time one of the best players in the world a year earlier. More than a year and a half earlier. And they had Biggs, who was considered the best Finnish player at the time. And they had Tico, who would later on go on to be one of the best Finnish players the next year. And so, strong team, but actually that team was underwhelming, and it ended up being the MCW Germany team who they played in the final, not to be confused with the MCW Swedish lineup who they'd played in the Mindtrek final and the CPL Oslo final. So they won this tournament fairly easily, but unfortunately, this tournament had no prize money either. Mindtrek line had no prize money, it was just you got a place and I think maybe tickets to the CPL. Clan-based Euro Cup, essentially your prize was to get to attend the LAN finals. I think they gave you travel expenses to the Netherlands to attend it. And then, I think it was in Rotterdam. And that was it. You just got to play a LAN, which at the time was still good, but you essentially were just playing for prestige. You didn't win any prize money, you just won the cup, which is like, yes. So anyway, this would be the end of that lineup. That was the end of eoLithic 2.0. Then we have eoLithic 3.0. And the way this lineup gets formed is a lot of fuckery. Because Damien, only something like 11 days after winning Eurocup, chooses to leave eoLithic to go and join his friend Element in Game Online. And so, wow, Element's stolen a player away. You know what the problem is? Something like 5 or 6 days later, Element himself leaves Game Online, leaving Damien there, goes back and joins eoLithic in Damien's place and kind of like switcheroo fucks him out of his spot and takes his spot in the lineup. And so, first of all, another reason why I think they might not have wanted Damien is Executor once told me in an interview he did in like 2010 or 2009 at SK that Damien actually was someone who was a bit slow at learning tactics. So Executor literally used to have to write the tactics down in a text file, a .txt, and give them to him and make him learn them. So I can see why he'd rather have Element. Obviously, Element and Executor had friction, but now eoLithic's at a low point. Element's stock was very high because here's an interesting thing. Element's Nordic Super Team had finished second at that CPL. So Element was on back-to-back seconds at Majors, and he'd only lost to 3D in the final this time. So his team was considered very good. And they'd beaten SK. So when Element wants to come back, and by the way, that's just Element again, leaving a second best team in the world, leaving the better team to join a team that he could have beaten and had beaten, comes to join this team, and they make the super team. Because now you've got the 3 best Norwegian players all in one team. In fact, arguably the 4 best Norwegian players in one team. Because you've got Executor, amazing player. Dark, maybe the best Norwegian player. Element, okay, probably the best Norwegian player, Element at the time. Dark, one of the best Norwegian players. Not Nikon, very skilled player, but it's questionable whether he or Damien was the best. So you've got at least 4 of the best. You've got the super team, finally, the best possible lineup you could make for eoLithic to some degree. Because you don't necessarily want Damien instead of Knoxville, because you want some team play aspect, right? And Knoxville's going to team play with Nikon, with Element, etc. So they make this lineup, and they actually managed to get some sponsorship help. It's announced that they've got Esports United sponsorship help, which Esports United had been the team who'd helped sponsor Team 9 beforehand, or even at this time, in fact. So 2003, they're going into with the new lineup. So here's the key thing about this lineup. The key thing is that, Element and Executor never got along and they had this friction and weren't in teams together. It only turned out they were one of the best combinations to play together in the history of any version of Counter-Strike. What made their combination incredibly powerful was that they were both in-game leaders, but with an extremely different skill set. So Element's skill set that he could apply as an individual player, but also worked on a game level, he was one of the most incredibly prescient players at being able to read the game and know what would happen next and know how what his team's doing would affect the other team and how the other team would even attack and the kind of formations they'd be using, and if he saw someone, where the other players must be on the map. And so he would use this ability to read the game to feed information to Executor on what was happening. And Executor was one of the best playbook strategists who built the playbook and built the tactics that could beat an enemy and could call the tactics. So if he got the good comms from Element, that's like he was almost getting the skill of Element to read the game. He could then call the right tactic, and this combination combined was fantastic and made this team not only one of the most skilled teams in the world, but one of the most dangerous tactical teams in the world, and on all the maps pretty much. They had a very good map pool, and like I said, very strong team in terms of raw individual skill and very good dynamics, because you look at the links all over the teams in terms of playing together. So you've got Dark and Nikon have played together. Nikon, Knoxville, Element have all played together. Obviously, Executor and Dark have played in the SK teams. You've got these connections all over the place, and Element's obviously played with all those guys except Executor. and Dark. So you've now got all these connections throughout the team, and that's why they were good in all aspects, basically. Now, what's funny, obviously, is that Element was still extremely strong, Execute was still extremely strong, Execute was still a fantastic clutch player, and obviously, this combination would later on in years come reunite in NOA in late 2014 and actually finally win the big titles and deliver on the promise of what that power was capable of. But funnily enough, that later on period would show how great the combo was, because that was when their individual skills had disappeared, but they still had this fantastic synergy and impact on the game as a twosome and as the in-game leading component. So you'd later see that. Now, with Dark and Element and Execute, you've got a fantastic skill level in the team, and that's one of the things that would allow them to battle any team. Now, sadly, they had to skip the first event of the year, which is CPL Cannes in France, because expenses. Even though they had this sponsorship help, they couldn't attend there. The expenses were too great. So the first event of the year, offline, would end up being in April, towards the second half of April. It was an event called Click Arena in France. I believe it was in Toulouse, if I'm remembering correctly. And unfortunately, this event was a train wreck. Like, the whole event got delayed like a day and a half. Then it ended up all being played over like a day and a half or something crazy. So the event ended up really late in the day. eoLithic would end up finishing second at this tournament and win 10,000 euros. I say win 10,000 euros. They never got the money because this was one of those scumbag events that just disappeared. Now, in the tournament, they got to play SK Sweden. And at this point in time, SK Sweden was a much better lineup. SK Sweden had actually won CPL Cannes, and at that tournament, they thrashed the Vesland's Team 9 team, which was called Team 9, in the final and wrecked them completely. And they meet SK, and SK at the time was Heaton, Potty, Brunk, Al, Fisker. So all the members except one of what would become later the great team of 2013 and dominate the second half of the year. But at this point in time, beatable. eoLithic beat them in an overtime game on train. Now, in the upper final, they had to play Team 9, Vesland's team, and they lost 11-13. The closest margin you can lose that in regulation in MR12. That was on Cobble, because at the time, that's just the way it was in these tournaments. These were single map, double elim tournaments, and you had to play maps like Cobble at the time, which was a trash map. Team 9 at the time, interesting note, had Luke, who was trialing for them, who had formerly been in eoLithic 1.0, and this would be the only event he'd actually play with them. They get revenge there. In the lower bracket, they face SK again, and eoLithic wins this match 13-10. Another close game. This was on Inferno. So in the final, they get to play Team 9. They're battling, but because it's double elim, they have to beat Team 9 twice. Already, this is taking place like 3 a.m., 4 a.m. Team 9, eoLithic wins the first game in like a double overtime game on train, an epic match. Then in the second map, it's incredibly late at night. They get thrashed on Dust 2, 13-7. End of the tournament, Team 9 wins. Team 9 gets the, whatever it was, 30,000 euros, 20,000, I think it was 30,000 euros for first place. So they had to finish second at their first tournament with this super lineup. Then was the period where, if you add in those other matches, is what people most remember about eoLithic. The stat I gave you before, beating SK in 6 out of 7 official matches. So the problem is, those two results are great because those are at a huge LAN that are really important, and they're at really important points in the tournament. Upper bracket semi-final, lower bracket final. Problem is, some of their other wins are at tournaments that don't matter as much. Like there was an ESWC qualifier in Sweden, I think at Cafe 9, which had formerly sponsored Cloud9 and Team 9. And at this tournament, they competed there with Swedish teams, etc. They won this LAN, and in it, they beat SK 3 times. They beat them in a mega... because it was ESWC, this was one of the first MR15 events. They beat them in an overtime game on Cobble in the upper final. Then in the final, they beat them... I think this is in the final, yeah. They beat them... Let me think. Why would they play them twice in the final, though, if they beat them in the upper? I'm not sure, but anyway, they beat them on Dust 2, they thrashed them, and they beat them on Dust 2 again in another game, and this was a much closer game, 16-11. So they beat them there, and they won this qualifier for a spot at the first ESWC, which is going to become a major, and was just being introduced at that time. Unfortunately, they'd never make it there, but we'll get to that. Then they played an online cup, which was like an ESL invite or ESL invitation cup of some kind for some Nordic teams, and they actually got a walkover win against SK, which means SK just didn't play the game, they forfeited it. And this team, I think, won this tournament. They beat Natu's Ion Zion team, I think it was what they were called, this Finnish lineup at the time. There was a LAN called Europa that was going to take place, I think, in Germany, and actually ended up being cancelled. And shortly after that, Element announced he was going to leave the team. He was going to go and join SK Gaming, the rivals that they've been beating all those times, because this was just the way Element was. I'll go into that I'm sure in a video or an article about him in the future. And the team just shut down 10 days later. They didn't have the sponsorship to attend events. I don't think they could have attended ESWC. They lost Element. Now SK's got Element. The team just disbanded, and the players went off. Element went off to SK. SK after ESWC, they've only placed top 3 there, would go on to be one of the most dominant teams of all time. Executor went to Team 9, who won ESWC and faced second at CPL Summer, the next major after that. The rest of them wallowed for a little while, but towards the end of the year, obviously would become NOA, and then the legacy of this team would go on in NOA to eventually feature 4 of the members of this particular last lineup. It would eventually have Element, Executor, Nikon would be the team that would win major later on, and they had Knoxville before that, but he was kicked out for Executor. And so 4 out of 5 of these players would eventually be part of NOA and accomplish better things in NOA, becoming the best team in the world in NOA, in many ways fulfilling eoLithic's unrealized destiny when they were the super team lineup here. There's also a time that 4 of them played together, which was in Oslo LAN in 2003, where they played in a mixed team called It's All Good, and that was Nikon, Element, Knoxville, Luke, and actually old school player BSL from Meredia, from Spacebar, and that was a 5-some, but actually they didn't win this LAN. Game Online won it with Hib and Soul Edge, etc., and a different lineup. Now then, you can see they were a team that teased constantly. They were the best team in the world at one point in time, but unfortunately that's actually the point in time where they didn't win the big LAN. They'd won the big European LAN. They couldn't win the major. They couldn't qualify. They couldn't win the biggest tournaments. They won the smaller tournaments. And despite their excellent form and potential and team play, tactics, individual skill, they never really established themselves in terms of the accomplishment aspects of the all-time great teams. When you're stacking up your top 10 teams of all time, it's hard to have them high up there, if even in the top 10, I'm afraid. Now then, dark times like that are past us. We can now play fantasy esports at Alpha Draft. The element of chance, of course, plays a part, but if you can execute your plan, there's no cons really to playing there. Or as the Scots might say, there's Nikon. I mean, there are some. You lose money if you're bad, but it's fun. It can be a hard knocks life if you lose your money, but as maybe a German might say in a ridiculously stereotypical World War II English movie about Germans, wie will win Skrilla, ja? Do you know what I mean? Look at their site for more details and be the envy of your friends by winning money at Alpha Draft.